In the brutal winter of 1884, 29-year-old stonemason Ethan Cross was banished into a 40-below blizzard with nothing but a ragged wool blanket, only for his wolf dog to dig open a buried timber hatch that led to a massive underground rock fortress untouched for 16 years. The gale that tore across the Black Kettle Basin of Wyoming Territory did not merely carry frost. It carried the cold, calculated cruelty of men who believed they could use nature to commit murder without touching a gun. 3 hours earlier, 29-year-old Ethan Cross had stood before the town council inside the timber courthouse. Ethan was a stonemason by trade, a quiet man with sun-bronzed skin, dark eyes, and hands calloused from years of shaping mountain granite. He owned a small, highly valuable claim along the western Basalt Ridge, a quarry that contained the valley's finest building stone. That claim was the reason Sheriff Thaddeus Black stood beside the mayor's desk. Black was 50 years old, a heavy, arrogant lawman whose sleek wool coat and silver badge hid a career built on extortion and land theft. When the town's main grain warehouse mysteriously caught fire 2 nights earlier, destroying the winter food reserve, Sheriff Black saw his opportunity. He publicly accused Ethan of arson, fabricating forged receipts to claim Ethan had sold the stolen grain to cattle rustlers down south. Black's plan was simple: seize the quarry under territorial emergency laws and drive the stonemason out before the truth could surface. Only one person in Black Kettle had dared to speak against the mob. Evelyn Vance, the 24-year-old schoolteacher and daughter of the late mayor, had stepped forward with her ledger, showing that Ethan had been working on the mountain bridge when the fire started. But Sheriff Black had silenced her with threats of arrest for obstruction, and the terrified town council, desperate for a scapegoat, passed a sentence of immediate banishment. Stripped of his boots, his coat, and his land deed, Ethan was handed a single, ragged wool blanket and shoved off the courthouse porch into the gathering blizzard. His only companion was Bane, a massive, silver-gray Irish wolfhound and sled dog hybrid, whose thick coat and intelligent dark eyes carried the untamed instincts of the high country. The heavy oak doors of the town hall slammed shut, and the iron deadbolt clicked into place. Within 20 minutes of leaving the town limits, Black Kettle vanished behind a blinding wall of horizontal snow. The wind whipped across the exposed flats at 50 miles an hour, dropping the temperature to a deadly 40 degrees below zero. Ice crystals sliced across Ethan's face like glass, and the cold bit through his thin linen shirt and patched trousers with terrifying speed. By the second mile, water from melting drifts had seeped through Ethan's worn boots. By the third, sensation had fled his toes entirely. His stride slowed as his thigh muscles stiffened under the encroaching hypothermia. He knew how winter killed men in frontier country. It did not strike with violence first. It crept in through numbness, offering the deadly comfort of sleep. Bane trotted beside him, his heavy tail dusted with frost. But as they reached the crossroads leading south, the big wolf dog stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head toward the western hills, let out a deep, chest-rumbling growl, and pulled hard against the hemp rope tied to his collar. "Wrong way, boy," Ethan rasped, his breath turning to ice crystals on his collar. "The town trail is south." Bane barked, a sharp, aggressive burst that cut through the roaring wind and lunged toward the dark, looming silhouette of the Basalt Ridge. Ethan hesitated. He looked down the flat valley road where the wind struck clean, brutal, and uninterrupted. Then he looked toward the high volcanic cliffs of the ridge. He knew stone. He knew that where volcanic basalt rose out of the prairie, the rock formations split the wind shear, creating pockets of broken air along the base of the cliffs. Staying on the road meant dying in a straight line. "Lead on, Bane," Ethan muttered, his jaw shaking violently. They left the wagon trail and began the steep, agonizing climb up the rocky slope. Loose shale slipped beneath Ethan's numb boots. His hands burned as he clutched frozen outcrops to keep from falling back into the ravine. Every breath scraped his lungs like dry lye. Near the crest of the ridge, Bane suddenly surged ahead, disappearing behind a towering mound of snow drifted against a sheer basalt cliff. Then came the barking, fast, desperate, frantic. Ethan forced his heavy legs up the drift, gasping for air. When he reached the dog, Bane was digging furiously into the packed snow beside the cliff face, spraying white powder behind him. Ethan dropped to his knees beside the animal. At first he saw only frozen rock, but as Bane cleared a deeper trough, Ethan heard something that made his blood run cold. It was not the sound of wind howling across open stone. It was a faint, hollow, rushing hiss coming from beneath the snow, a slow, rhythmic draft of air being drawn deep into the earth. Ethan clawed at the snow with his bare, bleeding fingers. 3 feet down, his knuckles struck something hard and straight. Nature rarely made straight lines in mountain basalt. He brushed away the ice crust, revealing a panel of heavy oak timber reinforced with rusted iron bands, set flush into the volcanic cliff face. It was a hidden subterranean hatch, buried beneath 16 years of mountain drifts. The surrounding rock face showed signs of old mason work, smooth, hand-chiseled lintels designed to divert water away from the frame. Someone had constructed a doorway directly into the volcanic hill. Bane pressed his nose against the lower seam of the timber door and let out a soft, eager whine. With the last of his failing strength, Ethan grabbed the heavy iron ring handle. The iron was frozen fast, but he threw his entire body weight backward, bracing his feet against the basalt ledge. With a loud, groaning screech of rusted hinges, the timber hatch swung outward 4 inches. A slow, steady draft of air spilled out into the blizzard. It was not warm, but it was dry, completely still, and free of the biting mountain gale. Ethan shoved the hatch wide open, pulled Bane inside by his collar, and slammed the heavy oak door shut against the hurricane outside. The heavy iron latch dropped into its socket with a solid, echoing thud. The screaming roar of the blizzard vanished instantly, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. Darkness swallowed them whole. Ethan knelt in the blackness, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs, while Bane shook the ice from his silver fur. Ethan reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, pulled out a small tin match safe he had managed to keep hidden from the sheriff, and struck a friction match against the stone. The tiny yellow flame flickered to life, illuminating a narrow, stone-cut passage lined with cedar support beams that descended deep into the dark heart of the mountain. The match flame flared, casting long, dancing shadows across the hand-cut cedar timbers lining the subterranean tunnel. Ethan held the tiny light above his head and began his descent down 30 steep stone steps carved directly into the dark volcanic rock. With every step downward, the screaming roar of the blizzard above became more distant until it faded into a faint, vibration-filled hum. The air changed instantly, losing the knife-like bite of the mountain gale, turning still, dry, and noticeably milder. At the bottom of the steps, the passage opened into a vast, vaulted chamber cut out of solid black basalt. Ethan struck a second match and touched it to the wick of an old brass oil lamp resting on a heavy oak table. As the yellow glow expanded, it illuminated a subterranean sanctuary that looked less like a temporary hideout and more like a fortress engineered for permanent survival. Thick wooden shelves covered the basalt walls from floor to ceiling. Every row was packed with provisions untouched by time. Glass jars of preserved carrots and navy beans, sealed barrels of rye flour packed in cedar sawdust, strips of dry salted venison hanging from iron hooks overhead, and small kegs of medicinal brandy. Nothing had been thrown there in haste. Every item had been arranged with meticulous precision. In the center of the chamber stood a massive cast-iron stove, its flat rear face anchored flush against a thick, smooth wall of polished black basalt. Beside the stove sat 2 cords of split cedar firewood, stacked neatly beneath oilcloth covers, completely dry and free of rot. Bane trotted across the dry earth floor, sniffed once near the stove, and let out a long, contented sigh, settling his large gray body near the hearth. Ethan moved through the room in awe. On a heavy workbench near the rear wall, surrounded by iron rock drills and brass surveying compasses, sat a thick, leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled canvas. Ethan picked it up, dusted off the cover, and opened the first page under the lamplight. The journal belonged to Gustav Lindquist, a Swedish mining engineer who had built the basalt powder vault in 1868 during the early silver boom. Lindquist had spent 5 years studying mountain geology before carving the chamber out of the cliff. Ethan turned the yellowed pages, reading Lindquist's neat, precise handwriting. Surface cabins are built by men who fight the winter with flat wood. They lose heat because the mountain touches every wall. But volcanic basalt possesses an immense thermal mass. It absorbs stove heat slowly, stores it within its dense mineral structure, and radiates warmth back into the chamber for 24 hours after the fire dies out. The earth keeps what it covers better than men do. Ethan closed the journal, feeling a profound sense of respect for the dead engineer. He knelt beside the cast iron stove, cleared the dry ash from the firebox, and built a small pyramid of dry cedar kindling. He struck a match and touched it to the wood. The cedar caught instantly, bright yellow flames crackling through the iron box. For 2 minutes the fire burned clean and hot, but then, without warning, a thick, choking wave of black smoke surged backward out of the stove door, filling the vaulted chamber with dense cedar fumes. Bane jumped to his feet, growling softly toward the dark ceiling. Ethan reacted instantly. He did not panic. He grabbed the oil lamp, climbed onto a heavy storage crate, and inspected the stovepipe where it connected to the ceiling vent. The problem was clear. The primary exhaust shaft, a 6-inch ventilation pipe cut upward through porous pumice rock to the cliff face, had been choked shut by ice and drifting snow from the blizzard overhead. Without a proper thermal draft, the smoke had nowhere to go, threatening to fill the airtight chamber with deadly carbon monoxide. Ethan remembered a diagram he had seen in Lindquist's journal moments earlier. He jumped down from the crate and searched the workbench until his hands found an 8-foot iron drill rod used by silver miners. Climbing back onto the crate, Ethan shoved the heavy iron rod upward into the narrow pumice exhaust shaft. He hit a solid plug of packed snow and ice 6 feet up the pipe. Ethan braced his boots against the crate, gripped the iron rod with both hands, and slammed it upward with all his strength. Once. Twice. On the third strike, he felt the iron rod punch through the frozen barrier. With a loud cracking sound, a massive block of ice shattered overhead. A shower of frozen snow collapsed downward into the ash trap, followed instantly by a sharp, ice-cold gust of air that rushed down the pipe and flickered the lamp flame sideways. Then, the stove let out a deep, sudden whoosh. The thermal draft caught. The rushing cold air created a powerful suction, pulling the trapped smoke out of the room and dragging it violently up through the pumice vent into the mountain storm above. Within 5 minutes, the cedar fire was roaring inside the cast iron box. Ethan sat on a wooden bench beside the stove, pulling off his soaked boots and setting them on the stone hearth to dry. Steam rose slowly from the worn leather as warmth returned to his white, frozen toes in sharp, tingling waves. Behind the stove, the massive wall of black volcanic basalt began to absorb the intense heat. The stone did not get hot to the touch. Instead, it began to release a soft, steady, radiant warmth that spread across the dirt floor and filled every corner of the subterranean room. Ethan opened a sealed jar of preserved beans, sliced a piece of dry salted venison, and shared the meal with Bane. As the dog chewed contentedly beside his knees, Ethan looked around the dry, warm, food-filled chamber. Outside, 40 below wind was howling across the Black Kettle Basin, searching for exposed cabins to freeze. But down here, 40 feet beneath the volcanic rock, the mountain had accepted them. Ethan closed his eyes and allowed himself a quiet thought he had avoided since being banished from town. He was going to survive. By the third day beneath the basalt ridge, time inside the subterranean fortress had lost its traditional shape. Without sunrise or sunset to mark the hours, Ethan measured life by the steady ticking of cooling iron, the soft breathing of Bane, and the slow, rhythmic release of heat from the volcanic stone wall. The basalt thermal mass worked almost too well. The cast iron stove had warmed the massive rock face until the chamber reached a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But on the morning of the third day, Ethan noticed a subtle, dangerous change in the air. A thin bead of moisture gathered along a basalt ceiling beam near the storage alcove. A moment later, a single droplet of water tapped softly onto a dry canvas flour sack below. Ethan inspected the grain barrels immediately. The outer layer of one rye bag felt damp and cold to the touch. He sat at the workbench and opened Gustav Lindquist's journal, turning the pages until he found the section on vault maintenance. Lindquist's warning was clear and emphatic. Heat without proper circulation creates a humid trap. Moisture condensed from human breath and snowmelt will rot grain faster than sub-zero frost. A subterranean room must breathe from 2 levels at once. Lindquist had engineered a dual-shaft pumice ventilation system to solve the problem. Ethan searched the lower rear wall behind a stack of cedar firewood until his iron pry bar struck a hollow wooden panel. Removing the cedar logs, he uncovered a second, smaller ventilation opening, a lower air siphon cut through porous pumice stone near the floor level. The lower intake shaft had been clogged with dirt and dry leaves. Ethan cleared the passage using a wire brush, opening the iron sliding damper. The effect was immediate and governed by fluid physics. Cold, dry, dense air from the lower cliff face was drawn inward along the dirt floor, while the warm, moist air near the ceiling was forced upward and out through the primary stove exhaust pipe. A natural convection loop was established. Within 3 hours, the condensation on the ceiling beams dried completely. The air inside the chamber turned crisp, clean, and balanced, holding a steady, comfortable 68 degrees while maintaining perfect dryness for the grain barrels. Late on the 4th night of the blizzard, as a 70-mile-an-hour gale raged across the plains above, Bane suddenly jumped to his feet. The wolf dog trotted to the base of the stone stairs, his silver ears pinned forward, a low, urgent growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan picked up his oil lamp and his rifle, walking silently up the 30 stone steps to the buried entrance tunnel. He pressed his ear against the heavy oak timber hatch. Through the roaring storm outside, he heard a weak, frantic impact against the wood, like a frozen hand hitting timber. Ethan lifted the heavy iron security bar, pulled the door open 3 inches, and was instantly hit by a swirl of blinding white snow and 40 below air. Kneeling in the drift outside, slumped against the timber frame, was 24-year-old Evelyn Vance. The young schoolteacher was near death. Her wool coat was stiff with ice, her gloves were frozen solid, and she clutched a small canvas pack containing warm wool socks and dried bread she had tried to bring to Ethan after his banishment. She had escaped the town during the storm, believing Ethan was freezing in an old shepherd's shack on the ridge, only to be caught in the blinding whiteout. Ethan didn't hesitate. He dropped his rifle, scooped Evelyn into his arms, and pulled her through the hatch, slamming the heavy timber door shut against the hurricane. He carried her down the 30 stone steps into the warm basalt chamber, laying her gently on a bed of dry cedar boughs near the glowing stove. Bane approached slowly, pressing his warm, dry nose against the girl's frozen hands. Ethan wrapped her in dry wool blankets and fed her spoonfuls of hot venison broth seasoned with medicinal brandy from Linkvist's supplies. It took nearly an hour before the pale, chalky color left Evelyn's face and her shivering began to ease. When she finally opened her eyes and looked around the glowing room, she gasped in absolute shock. She saw thick wooden shelves packed with 16 years of preserved food, dry cedar firewood, warm oil lamps, and a massive wall of black volcanic basalt radiating a gentle, living heat that filled the room. "Ethan," Evelyn whispered, her voice raspy from cold air. "What is this place?" "An old mining engineer built it 16 years ago," Ethan replied softly, handing her a tin cup of warm tea. "The mountain protects it." Evelyn drank the tea, her hands steadying as the warmth returned to her skin. Then she looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with urgency. "The town is dying, Ethan," she said quietly. "The blizzard has raged for 4 days. Sheriff Black's flat-walled oak courthouse had its roof sheared off by wind drag last night. Their wet firewood won't burn, the public well is frozen solid, and people are trapped in freezing rooms at 20 below zero. The sheriff took a posse out yesterday to hunt for stray cattle, but they never returned." Ethan looked at the warm, glowing basalt wall behind his stove, then at the sealed timber hatch leading to the storm above, and said nothing. The town that had banished him to freeze in the dark was now learning the true cost of building against the winter instead of working with it. By the 5th day of the Arctic whiteout, Black Kettle Basin had ceased to exist as a human settlement. The blizzard had simply erased it from the surface of the earth. Gales exceeding 80 miles an hour lashed down from the high mountain passes, whipping 5-foot snowfalls into massive solid drifts that buried fences, barns, and wagon trails 10 feet deep. The temperature had plunged to a deadly 45 degrees below zero. At that temperature, exposed skin froze solid in less than 30 seconds. Breath turned to ice before it cleared a man's lips, and the cold bit so deep into surface timber that log cabins groaned and split like dry bones under hydraulic pressure. In the valley below, the illusion of frontier authority had completely shattered. Inside Sheriff Thaddeus Black's ruined timber courthouse, the ground floor had become a freezing ice cave. The drag vacuum created by his flat oak walls had ripped away his roof days ago. Sheriff Black, his 3 remaining deputies, and 2 land speculators were huddled together under wet wool blankets in a drafty cattle shed behind the jail. Their horses had frozen standing in their harnesses. Their wet firewood produced only choking smoke, and Black's fingers were blackening with advanced frostbite. By midnight on the 5th day, the temperature inside the shed had fallen to 25 degrees below zero. Ice hung thick from the wooden stalls. Black's coal oil had turned to thick, unburnable jelly, and the lawman sat huddled in the dirt, listening to his men weep from the excruciating pain of hypothermia. He knew with absolute professional clarity that if they remained in that shed until sunrise, none of them would ever wake up. Sheriff Black dragged himself to a gap in the shed boards and looked out toward the western basalt ridge. Through the blinding whiteout, high on the volcanic cliff face where the wind was fiercest, he saw a single straight wisp of gray smoke rising into the sub-zero sky. It did not bend, it did not scatter. It rose straight upward, protected by the heat of a hidden chimney. "We move now," Black rasped through frozen lips, his voice a pathetic squeak. "We crawl for that smoke on the ridge, or we die in this dirt tonight." Desperation gave the freezing men strength they did not know they possessed. Sheriff Black, his 3 deputies, and 2 speculators stepped out into the blinding 45 below tempest. They could not walk upright, the wind was too violent. They dropped to their hands and knees, crawling through 5 feet of powdery snow, following the incline of the ridge toward the single chimney throwing warm smoke into the night. It was a journey measured in pure agony. Black's bare hands bled as he clutched frozen snow crusts. His mink-lined coat was torn to shreds, and his face was a chalk-white mask of frostbite. For nearly an hour, the men crawled through the white void, blind, gasping, near death. And then, suddenly, they crossed an invisible boundary. As Black dragged himself over the crest of the basalt ledge, the howling violence of the gale vanished. The screaming wind that had been tearing at his coat shot upward, passing 50 feet over his head in a loud, rushing roar. He found himself kneeling in a quiet, still basin of air. The snow on the ground was barely 3 inches deep. Before him stood the heavy oak timber hatch, set flush into the black volcanic cliff face, its seams glowing with a faint, warm yellow light from within. Black stumbled to his feet on trembling legs, staggered up to the door, and slammed his frostbitten, bleeding hands against the oak timber. "Cross!" Black sobbed, his voice cracking. "For God's sake! Ethan, help us!" 40 feet below, inside the subterranean chamber, Bane's silver ears shot upright. The wolf dog stood up from his rug, letting out a low, alert bark toward the tunnel stairs. Ethan did not hurry. He picked up his rifle, checked the brass cap under the hammer, and walked slowly up the 30 stone steps, accompanied by Evelyn Vance. He unlatched the heavy iron bar and opened the timber hatch 3 inches into the night. The warm, 68-degree air from the basalt chamber spilled out into the cold like a golden wave. Kneeling in the shallow snow on the threshold was Sheriff Thaddeus Black, stripped of every shred of his former arrogance. Behind him, 3 freezing deputies were dragging 2 semi-conscious speculators into the quiet zone beneath the cliff. "Mercy, Cross!" Black wept, holding up his bleeding, frost-blackened hands in open supplication. "Let us in! We're freezing to death!" Ethan stood on his dry, warm threshold, holding his rifle in the crook of his arm, looking down at the man who had framed him for arson, who had stripped his land deed, and who had banished him into a 40-below storm to die. He did not raise the rifle, nor did he step back to let them rush inside. "You called this place an arsonist's hole, Black," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the quiet night air with absolute, immovable clarity. "You stood on the courthouse porch and gave me a blanket, telling the town the storm would settle my claim." Black wept, hot tears freezing into icy beads on his cheeks. "I was wrong. God help me, Ethan, I was wrong. I'll give back your quarry. I'll give back your land. Just don't leave us out here in the dark." Evelyn Vance stepped forward beside Ethan, her eyes fixed on the shivering lawman. She reached into the inner pocket of Black's tattered mink coat and pulled out a leather-bound official pouch. Opening it under the lantern light, Evelyn gasped. Inside was the actual insurance receipt and a signed agreement with a land company in Helena, proof positive that Sheriff Black had burned the town grain warehouse himself to claim the insurance payout and force the sale of Ethan's basalt quarry. "He framed you, Ethan," Evelyn declared, holding the signed papers up in the lantern light. "It's all here in his own hand." Sheriff Black lowered his head into the snow, sobbing uncontrollably. "I signed it. I did it all. Just let us live." Ethan pulled a cedar shingle and a carpenter's pencil from his pocket, laying them on Black's bleeding knees. "Sign the confession on the shingle, Black," Ethan commanded softly. "Resign your badge and confess to the fire, right now, on the ice." With trembling, frostbitten fingers, Black scribbled his signature across the wooden shingle, dropping the pencil into the snow the moment the last letter was finished. Ethan picked up the shingle, checked the signature under his lantern light, and slipped it into his pocket beside Evelyn's evidence. Then he lowered his rifle, stepped back from the threshold, and opened the heavy oak door wide to the freezing men. "Evelyn," Ethan said quietly as he helped haul the semi-conscious deputies across the doorway. "Put the large kettle on the stove and fetch the dry wool blankets. We have guests." The great Arctic blizzard finally released its grip on Wyoming territory on the morning of January 25th. When the sun broke over the high granite peaks for the first time in 6 days, it revealed a Black Kettle Basin that had been entirely rewritten by the storm. The sky was a pale, blinding blue, the air was deathly still, and the valley floor lay buried beneath 6 feet of pristine, wind-carved snow, drifting as high as 12 feet against the timber stands. Throughout the basin, the price of frontier ignorance was tallied in heavy, silent losses. Down in the town, more than 80% of the flat-walled timber homes had suffered catastrophic structural damage. Roofs had been sheared off by wind drag, outbuildings had collapsed under drift weight, and Sheriff Black's grand timber courthouse existed only as a splintered, snow-filled shell resting in a mound of debris. Yet high on the western basalt ridge, the hidden chimney on the cliff face stood completely untouched, throwing a gentle, steady ribbon of gray smoke into the clear morning air. Inside the subterranean basalt fortress, 6 people woke to the soft yellow light of oil lamps and the steady, 68-degree warmth radiating from the volcanic stone wall. Sheriff Black, his 3 deputies, and the 2 land speculators sat around Linkfist's oak table, eating warm bowls of rye porridge and drinking tea prepared by Evelyn Vance. None of them carried the arrogance they had brought to the mountain days earlier. Their frostbitten fingers were wrapped in clean linen bandages from Linkfist's medical chest, and their eyes carried the quiet, humbled look of men who had stared into the jaw of winter and survived only by another's grace. At 10 o'clock that morning, a horse-drawn rescue sled carrying the territorial marshal and 3 town councilmen crested the western ridge, searching for survivors. Ethan, Evelyn, and Bane stepped out through the timber hatch into the brilliant winter sunlight to meet them. Behind them, Sheriff Black stepped onto the snow on trembling legs, supported by his deputies, his hands bound in white linen. Evelyn Vance did not wait for explanations. She walked up to the territorial marshal and handed him Sheriff Black's signed confession, along with the leather official pouch containing the forged receipts and insurance papers. "Sheriff Thaddeus Black burned the town grain warehouse himself, Marshal," Evelyn declared, her voice ringing clearly across the snow. "He framed Ethan Cross to steal his basalt quarry claim and leave him to freeze in the storm." The territorial marshal reviewed the signed confession, read the insurance receipts, and looked at the shivering, frostbitten lawman. Without a word, the marshal pulled a pair of heavy iron handcuffs from his belt and locked them around Black's wrists. "Thaddeus Black, you are under arrest for arson, extortion, and attempted murder," the marshal announced grimly, shoving the disgraced lawman onto the back of the rescue sled. The town council members stood in the snow, their faces pale with shame as they turned to Ethan Cross. The mayor stepped forward, pulling the forged eviction papers from his coat, and tore them into pieces before dropping them into the drift. "Your land deed and quarry claim are fully restored, Ethan," the mayor said, his voice quiet with remorse. "We owe you an apology that words can never pay. We believed a lie and sent an innocent man out to die." Ethan looked at the torn papers fluttering in the snow, then at Bane standing proudly beside his knee, and gave a single, quiet nod. "The storm proved what was true, Mayor. That's enough." Curiosity quickly overcame the council members' shame. They looked at the heavy oak timber hatch set flush into the volcanic cliff face, where warm gray smoke was rising into the blue sky. "How did you survive 45 below out here, Ethan?" the marshal asked, staring at the buried doorway. "Where did you shelter?" Ethan motioned toward the hatch. "Down 30 stone steps. Step inside and see." The marshal, the council members, and 2 local builders descended the stone stairs into the dark volcanic cliff. When they stepped into the vaulted basalt chamber, they stopped dead in their tracks, gasping in absolute disbelief. They felt the warm, dry, 68-degree air wrapping around them like a wool blanket. They saw thick wooden shelves packed with 16 years of preserved food, dry cedar firewood, warm oil lamps, and the massive wall of black volcanic basalt radiating a gentle, living heat throughout the room. Ethan walked to the workbench, picked up Gustav Lindquist's leather journal, and handed it to the head builder. This chamber was built in 1868 by a Swedish mining engineer named Gustav Lindquist, Ethan explained, his voice filling the quiet stone room. Surface cabins fight the winter from four sides with flat wood, building up drag pressure that tears off roofs. But volcanic basalt has an immense thermal mass. It absorbs stove heat slowly and radiates warmth for 24 hours. And the dual-shaft pumice ventilation keeps the air dry and clean without losing heat. The builders turned the yellowed pages of Lindquist's journal, staring at the thermodynamic diagrams, then at the glowing basalt wall, completely awestruck. "This isn't a dirt hovel," the head builder whispered, shaking his head. "It's a subterranean fortress." "It's an engineering masterpiece," the marshal corrected, looking at Ethan with profound respect. "And it saved 6 lives while the town above ground froze." Spring returned to the Black Kettle region of Wyoming Territory in early May of 1884, sweeping away the long Arctic darkness with warm Chinook winds and brilliant mountain sunshine. Snow retreated rapidly up the volcanic slopes, silver streams of meltwater rushed down the granite ravines, and wild blue prairie flax bloomed across the valley floor. The Black Kettle Basin, once a frozen wasteland of ruined timber and broken promises, began the slow, necessary work of rebuilding. But the town did not rebuild the way it had before. When the new construction began that spring, settlers and ranchers did not go to the timber mills to buy thin pine planks for flat, vertical walls. Instead, long lines of horse-drawn wagons creaked up the winding trail to the western basalt ridge. Builders, mason apprentices, and homesteaders from 3 counties arrived at Ethan Cross's claim, not to mock, but with sketch pads, transit levels, and notebooks, eager to learn the principles of subterranean survival. Ethan turned no one away. Together with Evelyn Vance, he stood on the basalt ledge outside the timber hatch, teaching every family in the territory how to read rock formations, how to utilize basalt thermal mass, and how to install dual-shaft pumice ventilation loops. He showed them how a room dug 4 feet below the frost line uses the Earth's natural ambient temperature to shield against sub-zero gales, and how volcanic stone absorbs stove heat slowly, releasing a steady, radiant warmth for 24 hours after the fire dies out. He shared the diagrams from Gustav Lindquist's journal, ensuring that the Swedish mining engineer's gift to the frontier would never be forgotten. Under Ethan's guidance, the settlers began digging deep subterranean root cellars beside their homes, lining their winter storage vaults with volcanic basalt and installing dual pumice air siphons. Across the Wyoming Territory, these earth-shielded stone chambers became standard construction for mountain homesteads, recorded in territorial survey maps and land office ledgers under a permanent, respected name, the Basalt Vaults. Ethan's stone quarry became the most vital enterprise in the region. The high-grade volcanic basalt he harvested supplied the stone for a new, fireproof town hall, a solid stone schoolhouse, and reinforced root cellars for every farm in the basin. In late May of 1884, as the mountain breezes carried the sweet scent of wild pine and blooming sage, Ethan Cross and Evelyn Vance held a quiet wedding ceremony on the basalt ledge outside the timber hatch. The townspeople gathered in the sunshine to pay their respects, not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude for the man and woman whose courage and wisdom had saved 6 lives during the Great Whiteout. Bane, the big silver-gray wolf-dog hybrid, rested peacefully in the warm sunlight near the open oak hatch, his dark eyes watching over the ridge he had uncovered on that terrifying 40-below night. Thaddeus Black's name vanished from local speech, remembered only as a bitter cautionary tale of corruption and arrogance. The former sheriff spent 7 years in the territorial penitentiary in Helena for arson and extortion, his health broken by the frostbite he had suffered while crawling through the snow to beg for shelter at the door of the man he had tried to murder. Years passed across the Wyoming high country. Ethan and Evelyn built a handsome 1-story stone home on the basalt ridge, connected directly to the subterranean volcanic chamber below. The deep vault remained their winter sanctuary, a place where their children grew up hearing the stories of the Swedish engineer, the wolf dog who dug through the snow, and the night the mountain opened its heart to save an innocent man. The heavy oak timber hatch on the cliff face remained set flush into the volcanic basalt, its iron straps dark with age. But the people of the valley gave the ridge a new name that endured through generations of Wyoming ranchers: the Basalt Fortress. The story of Ethan Cross was never simply about banishment, arson, or 40 below blizzards. It stood as an enduring, timeless testament to a frontier truth, that nature never surrenders to human pride, and survival is not granted to those who build higher, flatter walls to fight the storm. The greatest protection is often the one hidden beneath the surface, waiting for a man wise enough to listen to the earth. And when the great Arctic winter comes to deliver its final judgment, the only witness whose opinion truly matters is the mountain itself.